wanted to hear from our listeners on this week's episode of the Left Wing Podcast, and you do not let us down. I'd like to thank everyone who got in touch with talking points and questions for us to discuss on tonight's show, and we certainly have plenty to sink our teeth into. I'm Will Slattery, and I'm delighted to be joined by Cian, Tracey, and Luke Fitzgerald for our chat tonight. And lads, it was great to see so many people, as I said, getting in touch. And I want to start off with something that a few people actually sent us in. So it's obviously an issue that a lot of people are interested in. We got it in from Keith Cahill, Joe Hastings, and Mervyn Connolly, just to name a couple. And it's around the idea, Cian, I suppose, of how best to get game time into the increasingly growing number of young, talented players coming through the Irish system. We've seen the success of the 20s teams in particular over the last couple of years, 3 Grand Slams since 2019. And in contrast, maybe to France and England, when they have a lot more pro teams, we see those guys graduating very quickly into the senior ranks, whereas some of the top talented guys we see, in those Six Nations windows often have to wait a little bit longer. Is Irish rugby suffering from this kind of bit of a logjam or this maybe inability to get game time at a young age into these guys?
I think it is certainly an issue. I would agree, and you're right, Will. Several people got in touch with us, and I'd echo what you said. Thanks, Milt, for all the brilliant questions. Look, you touched on it there. I think the big problem, for want of a better word, is the fact we only have 4 pro teams, so game time is harder to go by compared to the top 14. They've got obviously the Pro D2 as well, similar enough in the Premiership, Championship. So that is the obvious sort of caveat to all of this. But that said, I do think there is a bit of an issue in trying to get the best young talent game time. Now, I would say, like, I watch and cover a lot of the 20s rugby. I still think there is a big jump going from playing 20s rugby into playing pro rugby, and particularly like the physicality wise. And you look at the way the 20s rugby is played, it's absolutely brilliant product. It's great to watch, but it doesn't necessarily translate to what is expected around set piece and things like that, the scrum. So I'm sure there's plenty of coaches who would argue that, but this was one of the things that David Nucifora tried and probably failed to do in his tenure, was to get more players to move. Sam Prendergast has been the latest example when Connacht were trying to get him on loan, and he's obviously going to stay. But a lot of guys seem to be keen to play for their home provinces, which is totally legitimate and totally fair enough. But we've discussed this at length, particularly like Leinster is the obvious example, that certain guys, and I think, get too comfortable playing in certain provinces without sort of pushing the boat out. So guys have to want to move to get the game time as well. It's all well and good us kind of coming on here and saying, well, this guy should go there, that guy should go there, but they have to want to move as well. And maybe that is a cultural thing that needs to shift. I think guys need to be more selfish about thinking about what's the best thing to do for their careers. So that's maybe from the player side of things. I definitely would like to see more like flexibility and scope for younger guys, who may be coming out of an academy or not guaranteed to get game time in the following season with a province, maybe going off and being a medical joker in France or, England, whatever the case may be. We've seen lots of, a good few younger guys have gone off and done it in France, and with the hope of obviously coming back. But you wouldn't like to see a younger player punished if, for wanting to go away and trying to get game time. Another thing that was floated was the idea of the IRFU potentially buying into London Irish when they were obviously going out of business. And that was something I think that they looked at. But I think the argument was that they wanted to make sure they had 4 strong provinces before sort of going down that route. And I have to say, I fully agree with that approach as well. So I think the short answer, Will, is that if there was a right answer to this, I think the IRFU, like, there's plenty of good people there, would have done it by now, but it's very difficult. And also, it's the rate at which the young players are being churned out in terms of quality young players out of schools rugby, out of 20s rugby. It's probably never been as good in terms of the volume. And I think that's down to the coaching that guys get at grassroots level, at schools level, at their clubs. So it is very hard to fit that game time into 4 provinces, because if there was a right or a better way to do that, I think it would have happened. There's so many different strands to this.
Yeah, I agree with your point there. Like, if there was an easy answer and an easy fix, we wouldn't need the debate in the first place. Ultimately, with 4 teams, it's a great thing to have in some ways, because it means you can concentrate at a lot of good players at each one. And broadly, Ireland have 4 very competitive teams considering other countries, but it just means there are maybe little pinch points at certain times. You mentioned a medical joker in France. Like, I think the Jack Crowley to La Rochelle was a very interesting case study when he turned that down to play with Ronan O'Gara. At the time, it seemed an obvious move to make in terms of his game time. You had Joey Carberry, Ben Healy there. Ultimately, that changed very quickly, and now he's the runaway kind of number 10 for Ireland. So I think a lot of players might look to that and say he backed himself and it worked out for him. Luke, what's your perspective on it? Because Cian touched on a lot of things there. As he said, no easy fix, but I'm sure you have some perspective. Obviously, having come up through the Irish rugby pathway yourself, you'll have an interesting perspective on it.
I'd say my perspective, based on my own experience, is probably not a great one to draw on for this, Will. But, just because, like, I kind of went straight in, that kind of way. And then Dennis Hickey retired. He retired very early, to be honest with you, and just opened the gap for me. So it worked out kind of perfectly for in my own circumstances. I think I would have made it anyway. But, yeah, I think my track might have been slightly different because I didn't do an academy. I didn't do any of those things. I went straight into the senior squad, So, I think, what I can draw on is my experience watching other players who I thought, well, that person definitely physically has it. That person has it upstairs. That person has the skills. And then they just never got the opportunity, or they got one opportunity and that was it. Done deal. Their coach had made up their mind that this person wasn't the person for the job, and then the big player was kind of back in the next day, and that was it. You're kind of sitting on the bench for another 6 months, kind of, you're basically just lifting weights for the next 6 months and throwing the odd pass here and there, in training. So I think I watched loads of those people, Will, and I think that's where I'd be kind of focusing my mind. I think there's loads of people that are kind of falling through the cracks because they're being given like kind of sporadic opportunities, and I think it's really, really hard to become, or to really solidify yourself into one of the teams without playing between 5 and 10 games in a row, allowing them to have a bad night, or a bad day at the office. And allowing them to have one or two, like even 2 or 3 bad days at the office. That doesn't really happen in Irish rugby because of, well, first of all, there's just not that many opportunities. But there's just not that many places. There's just not that many spots for people to fill. And you're generally, if you're playing in the provinces, the big players might get 1 or 2 games off, but generally they're back for the third. So you just don't get a big body of games to do that. Now, the obvious thing for me, I look, the London Irish thing is a really interesting talking point. That would have been an ideal, kind of scenario, because you get people exposed to a fairly tough league. You kind of battle harden them. And you could bolster a squad with some really good young Irish talent, and they'd get an opportunity to play. But look, financially, that London Irish have been struggling for a long time, so that one was not going to work. I think it was probably too big a risk financially for them to undertake. Whereas I do think they're already, have an opportunity to do that. I think, you look at the financial situation in Ulster particularly, that's an obvious place, because you're, pretty much already paying players in Leinster or at least funding both provinces in Leinster and Munster to have guys who are kind of sitting on benches or not even in squads on a weekend. And I think those, you look at Connacht and Ulster, they could definitely do with some of that talent there. And that talent could also do with being on show and competing against, top class international or top class players week in, week out. Because as you said, it's very different to playing under 20s rugby. You might have the raw materials, you might not, but you could still look good at 20s. Whereas I think, it's even in the league, you kind of do get found out, whether you're not big enough, you don't have the head for it, whatever it is. That's a much better indicator of how far someone can go, I think, than the under 20s. So I think they should be trying to expose people by moving pieces around the puzzle. You just need a good salesman in there to just tell people this is what you need to do. You could sit, like, you look at the likes of a Scott Penny, or he's a kind of perfect example. He's nearly man of the match every time he plays in the league, but he's nowhere near starting a Heineken Cup game for Leinster. He could be brilliant in one of the other provinces. So, that's just one off the top of the head. But the 10 situation in Leinster, Harry Byrne is another one who I think has been sitting there for ages. That had a few injury problems here and there, but he should be in another province 100% to my mind, because he is a top class operator and has never really had an ability or had an opportunity to show himself in 10 and 15 games. Can he do it? Can he do it at the top level? Is he a top class professional rugby player? Could he be an international 10? So there's these kind of opportunities. These guys are littered all the way through Irish rugby, and I think we have two outlets at the moment that could really do with getting some more resources and getting some kind of cheap resources, I think, as well, that could have massive upside. So, yeah, I don't get it. I think it's a problem, because I think, we're going through a phase at the moment where we are producing loads of top class players. But if you don't capitalize on it, or if they don't see opportunities where they can get into the Irish team, because that's every young player's dream, is to play in the Irish jersey, do they fall away? Do interest levels fall away? Like, does the Irish team, if the Irish team isn't doing well week in, week out, if they're not winning Six Nations, does the interest levels fall at the underage levels? All those things have an impact, Will, and it's very changeable, So I think you need to capitalize while strike while the iron's hot. I think they need to start moving some pieces around the puzzle.
I think just to come in on that, Will, I think it has happened over the last few years, and it's already happening in this preseason where guys are more willing to move at academy at a younger level straight out of school. So I agree with what Luke is saying. There are times where you could look at Ulster and Connacht and think that they could definitely be bolstered by some guys, particularly from Leinster. But you look at
Deegan would have some impact up there. So sorry, just coming. I think there's so many of them, Keen, isn't there? There really is, like.
Yeah, like Max Deegan, I just hope that in years to come that he doesn't, regret his decision to stay, because you have a guy like James Culhane is coming through now. There's just no guarantee that he's going to get game time. Jack Conan, I think we're all agreed on that. But just to go back to, like, you look at what Ulster are bringing into their academy this offseason, Will, they've got Jack Murphy, Philip de Klerk and Sam Berman, three guys from the Leinster system, for want of a better term, are all going up there. You look at Connacht, they're getting Ben Murphy and Lassisi, the prop from Connacht as well. So it is happening at an academy level. But I suppose the question is maybe that middle tier of guys, the Max Deegans who are sitting in a logjam, because the guys in your academy aren't the ones, okay, they're absolutely vital squad players, but they're not the ones that you're going to be relying on to play, 15, 20 league games a season. So like I said, there are plenty of strands, and you look at like this Scottish system, that they only have two teams, and obviously we have four. And I was talking to a coach not that long ago in Scotland and reckoned, the fact that they only have two, and look, there's a lot of ways you can look at this. You can look at the fact that, look, it's easier obviously to control the players, to have a playing identity, but he reckoned actually that complacency sets in because it's easier to get picked for the national team because there's only two teams that you need to impress in. So that's another sort of interesting viewpoint that I probably hadn't looked at either. So David Humphreys has a big job on his hands, to be fair. He is being left with very strong foundations, apart from the women's side of the house that David Nucifora has done in his tenure, but he still has things to figure out. And I know I saw one of the questions, and not to jump ahead, but one of the big things is obviously going to be around the front row and producing props, which probably does feed into this conversation. But you see now, whether it was his decision or whoever's it was, but the decision not to be signing foreign props after next season is quite significant, which I think feeds into this part of the conversation too.
Yeah, look, that's something we never really touched on in our general show, like that move by David Humphreys, which is a big kind of stance to take. Are you a fan of it? Because it is a kind of an area over the years where Leinster have invested in, say, Michael Alalatoa, Rabbi Slimani, who's come in now for next season. But it is an area, like even watching the under-20s play against England in the World Cup semi-final, like 2 weeks ago, they were absolutely destroyed at the scrum, where all the other facets of the game were pretty good, but the scrum was very worrying. So it's clearly an area from the grassroots on up that's vital to get right.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant decision. I think, might be a bit of short-term pain there, but it means you've got to, it'll light a fire under people investing in the area, investing time, trying to scout, different people, trying to be creative because like the one thing we probably don't have in Ireland is, access to like, a huge amount of these kind of massive athletes. We're just not massive people. And in fairness, like, you look at the hurl on the weekend, you look at the football next weekend, like a lot of our best athletes are probably playing Gaelic football, aren't they? So we just don't have access to the same amount of people. So I think it's going to take a bit of creativity, a bit of vision from someone, and it's going to take, a serious focus to really get the best out of the resources that we have, because we definitely have them there, and I think we're a great sporting nation for the amount of people that we have. So we have them. We just got to unearth them. And I think this will force people to do it. So I love the decision. Well, I think it's really good.
Yeah, and fair play for David Humphries coming right in off the bat with a big decision, because everyone was curious what he might try to do or what kind of stamp he's tried to put on it. And obviously, that's quite a bold one to come in right away. One thing I want to just tie this off on, it's interesting, France and Ireland played in the 2023 Under-20 World Cup final. There was a lot made of it at the time, Sam Prendergast and among a few young prospects. 6 of that French team have played for the national team already in a year, which is pretty startling. I know there's a lot more opportunities, as I said, in the top 14, and they went on kind of a development tour to Argentina somewhat. So Fabien Galtier experimented a lot, but it shows how much game time those guys have gotten in one season, that Fabien Galtier felt comfortable giving 6 of those players international exposure, which is crazy. That was a very strong French team. We might be looking back in years to come as one of the real great underage teams, but I just thought it was a very interesting contrast, considering that Irish team at the time was being talked of as one of Ireland's great talented crops. So just thought that was interesting. It's funny, I thought we might do quick fire questions, but as I knew when we got into these discussions, we probably would be on them for a while. So I want to move on to the next one, Cian. It was coming in from Andrew Donoghue, and it's about the Irish lineout. And he's asking, should Paul O'Connell be under a bit more pressure for the performance of the Irish lineout? No one wants to seem to ask this, as he's such a legend of Irish rugby. And I think certainly the lineout has been a focus. I don't think that's true, but I do agree that Paul O'Connell, for the man overseeing that, hasn't got a lot of direct criticism, and he is such a big figure in the game. Maybe it does insulate him to a degree, because it's been a very troubled position. I know Luke has been someone who's been fixing on it quite a bit. What's your read on that question?
Yeah, like I think we've certainly spoken about the line out a lot. Yeah, have we been calling out Paul O'Connell? Probably not, because I still feel that if he wasn't there and the Irish lineout was struggling, you'd kind of be thinking who would be a good guy to come in and be, steady the ship. And okay, the lineout hasn't been great for the last while. It's definitely been hit and miss for the last whatever year, 18 months. But I have a few sort of different takes on this. I think, first of all, I think there's been a bit of disruption to the lineout. I think James Ryan has been the main lineout caller for a while. He obviously had injuries. He lost his place in the team. You're bringing a guy like Joe McCarthy into the team, who is clearly very young and wouldn't be a natural lineout, certainly caller at that age. So the responsibility has gone to Ian Henderson when he's been playing, does it a lot at Ulster, and Tyke Byrne, who has taken it on along with Peter O'Mahony over the last couple of years for Munster. So that's been a bit of change where I don't think we should sort of overlook and gloss over. I also think that, and I've never been in a line out before, but something I have been thinking of, particularly around the South African tour, was, and they're obviously a special example in the fact that how good they are in terms of their defensive line out in particular. But I'd say it must be harder than ever to run a smooth line out. And a couple of reasons why I think that. I think the level of analysis that goes on nowadays is just absolutely huge. You look at the size of the backroom teams, the guys working on video. So the amount of footage that's being poured over, there's a huge emphasis, I think, on coming up with different plays, coming up with different moves that you're not being read by the opposition. I also think the fact that a lot of teams now, Ireland included, particularly in that second test, are playing with essentially a third lock in the back row. So I would say on your own ball, it's even harder than ever to win your own ball, because you've got at least 3, if not 4, absolute units in terms of trying to seal your ball. So that's not to give Paul O'Connell in the Irish lineout a free pass by any means, but I do still think, and like you talk to any of the players now, not that they're going to badmouth their coach, and particularly not, like you said, with a legend like Paul O'Connell, but even chatting to people here and there off the record, they rave about Paul O'Connell's coaching. And a lot of people could say, look, great players don't make great coaches, but I think Paul O'Connell is still absolutely the right man to have in there. And I do think it will come right with maybe, less injuries, less disruption, guys playing with each other like the likes of Joe McCarthy a bit longer. So there are a couple of thoughts that I've had. I'm not sure if you guys agree on the whole maybe playing with an extra lock and the level of analysis that's going on.
Yeah, I think they're great points, Cian. I think they're up there, definitely valid. I would say I do think it's sometimes when I look at it, and it could be down to those factors that you're talking about, but certainly the factors in terms of the changeover between the kind of lock combinations and the line out callers. But the Irish line, looks a little clunky. I think the Leinster line looks a little clunky at times in attack. I would say that you can see like the analysis. Our defensive line is still excellent, I think, and so is the Leinster one. We've got great athletes there. As I think you're right. I think most teams have great athletes. The one thing I'd say is I'd love it just to look a little smoother. In Paul's defense as well, I think. Would you say that we have world class throwers? I don't think we could say that. I think we could say we have certainly world class hookers, but I just don't know if that facet of their game is actually their strongest part. Which I don't know. I don't know if you guys agree on that one. But certainly to my eye, it looks like they're not unbelievable throwers. I don't think. But I think they are thrown into very difficult situations, high pressure against really good teams who've done the research, and I think, as I said, the lineup looks a little clunky to me. It doesn't look really, really smooth, and it doesn't look like they're hitting the guys at the very top of the lift either, like an outstretched hand. When you see one where you go, that was a great compete, but the throw was too good, as was the lift, So I don't see that an unbelievable amount of time with Ireland. And I also it looks like they're going to shorten lineouts a lot to me, which tells me that they feel like they're under pressure to get their hands on it, So, look, there's a lot of factors that go into it. In terms of the Paul O'Connell thing, nah, that's just madness talking about that. Talking about like if you think we're kind of bringing it up here and there, saying we think there's a problem, like I tell you now, having played with the guy and knowing him, he's poring over it. Like if we've said it once, he's been looking at it 150 times, that kind of way, and analyzing it to death. So, it's whether he needs to take a step back and be a bit more relaxed about it, maybe not overanalyze it, maybe just, simplify it or something like that. I'm sure he'll have thought of all the angles on that, and I'm sure he'll come up with the right answer because, and I think it should be a collective thing too. I don't think it'll all fall on his shoulders, So, yeah, look, I think, you'd hope he'd get a bit of consistency with guys coming in. I think Ryan will come back into the fold now. I think, it'd be great to see him go injury free this season. I think he's absolutely key for Ireland and Leinster. I think he's really underappreciated, and I think he could be the guy to settle things down. And Henderson coming back as well. Like Henderson probably seems like he's the most experienced, which obviously helps too. But he seems like the best line-out caller of the lot as well. Probably the most natural as well. So I think there's a couple of factors that I think I think it'll get better. And if you ask me, like Paul O'Connell, if you have a chance to have him in your group in any capacity, you have him in. He's just an unbelievable personality to have around. And you put him alongside of, Farrell. I think, I have to say, John Fogg's a great guy too. Like really, like they've such a nice balance of guys in there. So Paul falls into that bracket for me. Big personality, 100% have him in your changing room. He needs to be there. It's not even a question of that. But look, as I said, they'll know. I think, well, I hope they'll know that the lineout needs to be better. It should be a real attacking weapon for Ireland, and they should be. With the people they have and the athletes they have, they should be able to get great ball in a full line out, good attacking ball. So I think they get that right this year with a bit of focus, and it becomes a weapon for Ireland again.
Yeah, I think both of you have made a lot of good points about the line out, Cian with the personnel stuff, and Luke about Paul O'Connell. Like his arrival coincided arguably with Ireland's kind of uptick in form under Andy Farrell initially. Like his arrival was a real kind of, at the time, people were pointing that out as one of the key changes that was made under Andy Farrell. But I will say to the listener's original question, of course, being an Irish rugby legend does insulate you from a bit of criticism. Like when Mike Catt, when the attack wasn't going well, he didn't have that status as a legend. And Mike Catt was getting a lot of criticism, as kind of being blamed for it. I feel like if the shoe was on the other foot and it wasn't Paul O'Connell being the coach, I do think he might get more criticism, but that's not to say he doesn't deserve his place in the squad as a coach, which I think he does, or that he hasn't had great success with the squad, which he has, or that he can't change things and get better again, which I think he could.
And I would just add to that, Will, just from behind closed doors, there's just not a better bloke. Seriously, he's an absolute, like they say, legend playing ability and all that kind of stuff, captaincy. He's an absolute top man to be in the setup, like really good behind closed doors, a proper one of the lads, and and always like demands unbelievably high standards of everyone, but it's just a seriously good personality. So he's a winner, not even a question whether you keep him if you have a choice.
Yeah, but it will be a big topic going into next season if the lineout can improve. We might move on to the next one, Cian. I'll go to you with this. Mark Wright has asked, with 3 years to go until the World Cup, does the panel think Ireland should prioritise building squad depth over targeting other competitions like the Six Nations, Southern Hemisphere tests and stuff of that nature. That's always an age-old question, especially with Ireland's World Cup record. Like, what should the focus be between the cycles? Ireland are the world champions, are kind of hitting their mark between World Cups. Not as much maybe when it comes to the big dance. What's your view on what should be the priority?
I have quite a strong view on this, and you're right. You can be guaranteed we'll be asked this question again around the Six Nations, going into the summer tour, things like that. In my opinion, anyway, you should never use the Six Nations as a place to just blood a load of young guys. It's far too important, and everything shouldn't be centered around once in every 4 years a World Cup. Look, that's even allowing for Ireland's really poor record over the years. I just don't think we should ever get to a place where it's just purely about peaking for a World Cup. Obviously, that is the ultimate goal, but the Six Nations and everything that comes in between are still really important steps along that journey. So that's my sort of overriding point. But to go a little bit deeper, and I made this point, lads, with you on one of the pods that we were doing during the South African tour. Change is happening in front of our eyes in terms of the Ireland squad and the Ireland team moving on from the last World Cup. But a lot of people seem to think, and I'm not saying the listener who sent in the question is one of them, but a lot of supporters seem to want it to happen much faster. So we go back to the first test. Jamie Osborne starting at fullback. No one saw that coming, and you could name 3 or 4 players that could have been in with a shout that would have been deemed a much safer option. So there's one. Craig Casey started the first test. A lot of people would have said, go with Conor Murray, the safe pair of hands. No, Andy Farrell went with that. You've got Jack Crowley, who is still in his first full season as Ireland's starting 10. Calvin Nash is in his first full season playing on the wing. It's like, that's already a very different Irish backline. And of course, like, if Hugo Keenan had been there, he would have been playing. But like I said, there were safer options that Andy Farrell could have went for. Joe McCarthy up front is still very new to the scene. So while I understand everyone wants to see, the next big thing, there are changes happening. Caelan Doran is taking over as captain. That could be a real watershed moment for going towards the next World Cup. Andy Farrell, I think, has a big decision to make now over the next few months, that who's going to be captain for that November series. Is he going to stick with O'Mahony, or is that going to have been the turning point where Doris leads Ireland from here on in? Look, and I've no doubt we're going to get a couple of other players that are going to come onto the scene over the next year. So one thing that we should have probably mentioned in around the game time question was, this is the reason why the IRFU are bringing back the emerging Ireland tour, is that they want to get more games into the guys who are at that younger level. I think we're going to see guys there's 4 games this November, so that's 1 extra. That allows more scope to get game time in. And next summer, during the Lions tour, David Humphreys was speaking to the lads who were in South Africa, and it sounds like Ireland are going to be going to Georgia and Romania next summer. That's clearly going to be a development tour as well. So there are a huge amount of opportunities lying ahead that you don't have to say, oh, well, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater in the Six Nations because we need to play loads of new players. That is already happening in front of our eyes. And over the next, I think, 12 to 18 months, I think we're going to see an even bigger churn.
I think you hit on a lot of good points there. And if you actually look at the team that took the field against the All Blacks in the World Cup quarter-final, there was actually a nice kind of sprinkling of guys who had been there at the previous World Cup and guys who had made their debuts at various times over the 4-year cycle. It wasn't by any means like kind of an old, tired team. I know ultimately they came out on the wrong side of a narrow defeat, but it actually was a team that evolved over the course of 4 years. Like, say, Mac Hansen would have come in kind of as a bit of a flyer. Dan Sheehan would have emerged. Caelan Doris would have emerged over that time period. So I agree with you. I think it has kind of happened incrementally. And Luke, the Six Nations is one thing, but I also think it's worth targeting that South Africa tour that we just talked about. Like, we were in particular putting that on the pedestal. We were kind of being a bit critical of Hugo Keenan's decision not to go on that tour, because I certainly, watching it, value it as a really massive scalp to get a win there, or the All Blacks series a couple of years back that they won the 3-test series there. I think they're huge things to chase and to target, and I wouldn't be a massive fan of opting to use those as more development style tours. What's your kind of view on what Cian said and something like that as well?
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, there's obvious development tours. That one next summer is an obvious one. But no, like, certainly for the big matches, you've got to try and win every international you can. I'm a big believer in momentum. I think there's probably obvious points along the journey where, you probably need to, you need to give someone a little bit of exposure. Like, I think while I agree in principle on the kind of World Cup squad and particularly the match against New Zealand. The obvious part of that is that no one really played enough rugby behind Sexton. And he kind of had to go probably too long into that game, I think, and because the guy behind him just didn't have the trust. You could clearly see there was space for someone to come on and make a big impact, whether it was Frawley or Crowley or whoever you picked. Um, so that's an obvious one to say. You need to find a sprinkling of it, but no, I think Andy Farrell has got it right. I think generally Ireland get it right. I'd rather be coming into a World Cup playing well than playing poorly. Like, it was just an absolute shame that Ireland saved their worst match in probably a year and a half for the kind of the game against New Zealand, and in fairness, still probably should have won that game, to be honest with you. Like, how they didn't score off that maul. And then some of the tries they let in, it was a really bad performance, and they still nearly beat New Zealand. So I think we can be overly critical about how we look back on those things. I think we're getting closer. I think the consistency will help. I think winning big tours, big matches, things like that match in South Africa. If you don't come back from that as an international player and think, well, I can mix it with anyone and have that belief going into every single game, um, then I think you've missed a trick in your own mind. Because to my mind, like, if you ask me if I'd won a match then there, when it gets tough, when it comes down to the wire against France, or it comes down to the wire against England or New Zealand or whoever it is, if I've done it against South Africa on their soil, when it all, when they've got their best team out there, double World Cup winning side, if I've done it there, I know I can find that again, and I know that belief is always there within you. So I'm a big believer in those things. I think it's really important to have a big, a really good World Cup cycle, and because it's very hard to peak for a tournament like that without having played well at all before it. Yeah, no, I think they're going about it the right way. I think, yeah, as Cian said, I'd agree. I think you're already seeing the kind of the next cohort come in the kind of key positions. I'd still like to see, them probably not play Porter as long. I think they could burn out his career a little bit. I think that could be a problem. They need to find and trust someone else. That could be a problem because miles on the clock for him they're really. I don't know. It looks to me like they're really burning him out. I know he's a brilliant athlete, loves the gym and all that kind of stuff, and he might last a little bit longer than the average guy because he's such a good athlete. But I think that'll be a problem because I think you're probably seeing the last 2 or 3 years what happened to Furlong because they had to play him every week or they felt they did. So you do need to take some chances here and there, Will, and show some faith. But I'd be going to win every match. That's worth it, 100%. And I think most of the international matches are worth it, if I'm being honest.
Even if you look at to go back to the second test and the manner in which Ireland won it with the drop goal, you look at like the important role that Stuart McCloskey played by making that lovely break on the outside. Kieran Frawley puts the kick through. Obviously, then they win the line out. And Caelan Blade throws the 2 passes for the 2 drop goals to Kieran Frawley. Like, they're 2 guys who haven't been in around the squad for that long. Like, they're fresh enough faces as well. So I thought I'd mention that in terms of people wanting to see quicker turnover. It's happening. Like, it's happening if you look closely enough.
Yeah, that's a good point about that last drop goal we touched on. It was kind of the guys you would not have expected to get such a moment who delivered there. So certainly one to watch, especially Keen, as you mentioned, in November. Very interesting schedule. 4 matches. They have the All Blacks, I think Argentina, Fiji, is it? And then Australia with Joe Schmidt coming to town to finish it all off. So it'll be interesting to see how Andy Farrell picks his squads over those 4 weeks. Okay, this is going to be a quick fire round. Rob Hosey asked us to pick a player from each province heading into next season who will be a breakout star. Luke, I'll go to you first. Do you want to give us 4 players, 1 for each province?
Oh, 1 from each. Okay. Ulster is a Chuku, although he's probably there already. But I think if he stays fit, he's a star. I think breakout star. I think this is the season for Frawley. If it's not this one, then it's never going to be it. So I'm going to say Frawley. Probably 2 obvious ones. In Munster, I think Ahern, although you could probably argue this season was, but I think Ahern is a big year next year and pushes to get into the Irish team. Pushes Baird, I think, pretty hard, actually. So I'm going to say Ahern. And for Connacht, oh, God, well, does it have to be a breakout? It has to be a breakout, yeah.
Well, it can be.
Breakout I was going to say Hansen coming back in. I think Hansen comes back in and has a flyer. I think he's such a good player. And I think that was a really bad shoulder injury he got. So I think he's actually had a bit of a nightmare with it. Um, but is Hansen a boring answer? It is a bit. Oh God, because he's so good already. Who's the young scrum half there? That
Devine,
looks
Matthew
like
Devine.
sorry,
Matthew Devine.
Matthew Devine. He looked like a nice little player, nice bit of spring about him. I think he'll push Blade. Although that's a great finish of the season for Blade, as you said, he'll have a lot of confidence coming back in. I'll go Devine because everyone knows, I think we know what Hansen brings. So yeah, Devine.
Yeah, well, my forward for Connacht, I went with Hugh Gavin, who's been a really good player for the under-20s the last 2 years. In the centre, obviously, they're well stocked in that area with Bundyaki, but Bundyaki doesn't play a huge amount for Connacht these days, and when he does, his form isn't quite as good as it is in for Ireland. So I could see Hugh Gavin having a really good season. I actually went with Thomas O'Hearn as well for Munster. Obviously, he is established to a degree, but I think he could be primed for a really good season next year. With Ulster, I went with Aidan Morgan, the new out half. I just think there's a big opportunity for someone to play 10 for Ulster. And if they do well, all of a sudden they could be knocking potentially on the international door, as we said, or at least in the emerging Ireland tour to come. And with Leinster, I went with Ronan Kelleher purely just because Dan Cian is going to be out for the majority of the club season. I thought he had a very physical performance against the Springboks in the second test. And if the line out can be tidied up, both for Leinster and Ireland, he could all of a sudden have massive say in the line selection, next summer. So they're my four. Cian, what about you?
Love that. Love the Kelleher one.
No, sorry. Thanks for leaving me to last while you got all the first picks.
You can copy me if you want. I had very good choices.
I had Hugh Gavin was my Connacht one. I think he's been one of the best 20s players over the last 2 years. And I think he looks like he's ready to play in the URC. I think next season I'd be very surprised if we don't see him getting game time. But just because you picked him, I'll say Che Mullins, which I suppose is a bit timely because he's in the 7 squad, which is obviously starting now in the Olympics. I've been surprised that he hasn't gotten more game time. He had a really good 20s level, unbelievably quick, athletic winger. I know he's been playing a bit in the AIL as well, which is obviously a hugely important avenue for guys like him to get game time too. So he'd be one to watch. And Santi Cordero coming back in fully fit is a huge boost. If you can get him and Matt Hansen into the same back three, that'll be fun. Leinster, I picked out. I'd really like to see more of James Culhane next season, but I just think he is going to be stuck in that logjam unless he can burst through. But I went for Paddy McCarthy, Joe's younger brother. He's still very young. He's after making the switch from tight head to loose head, which nicely feeds into the point that Luke made about Andrew Porter. Look, they've clearly looked at this. Anyone who you speak to about this guy, who they worked with him in Blackrock and Trinity, says that this guy is the real deal, and it's only a matter of time before himself and Joe are playing in the same Leinster and Ireland team. I think it does take props a little longer to mature and develop, but if you look at the lack of props in the Irish system and pushing the likes of Cian Healy and Andrew Porter, I think it's time to fast track a guy like this. So I'd love to see a guy like Paddy McCarthy. He's one of a few really good young props that Leinster have. I'd love to see him getting more game time. For Munster, I went with Brian Gleeson. Along with Hugh Gavin, I think he's been the best under-20s player over the last 2 years. Had a tough time with injury this season. We might have seen him playing a bit more than we did for Munster. He's a guy who has it all. I think he looks like a complete back row. He's quick. He's got good hands. He's got a bit of a Muck Savage, I think, in him as well, which is no harm as well. So fascinated to see how far he can go. And one name I think is worth keeping an eye on. He's coming into the academy this year. For anyone who hasn't seen or heard of him, this guy, again, looks like the real deal. His name is Jean O'Leary Kareem. He was the captain of the Prez Senior Cup winning team this year, but he actually played in 3 consecutive Senior Cup finals. He's a centre. Munster haven't produced an awful lot of homegrown centres over the last couple of years, and he is a guy who could be fast-tracked, I think, as well, over the next season. It might be the end of the season by the time he gets in, but remember the name. And in Ulster, kind of similar enough, I went for an academy guy. I mentioned him earlier on. He's after making the move from Leinster, Sam Berman. A lot of people might have seen him score a hat-trick at the 20s World Cup against Italy. He looks like a great player. I've been chatting to a few people in Leinster, and they're already hoping that this guy isn't going to be one like a Tadhg Byrne, who they possibly allowed slip through the net a little early. So he looks like he's got a high ceiling as well. He plays in the centre. So whether he can break through next season might be a bit early, but again, I think he's one worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, plenty of good options for breakout stars next year. Nice smattering of young and old players who could have big years next year. One last question I want to ask you guys, lads. On this one, I found interesting when I thought about it a bit. It was from Gav Mercer, and he was asking about Jordie Barrett coming into Leinster next year. Obviously, with a lot of fanfare, where he might fit in. And when I was thinking about it more, Luke, it's a no-brainer for me that he starts it out half. That's like the obvious place to play Jordie Barrett. Like, he has all the skills. Leinster are stocked everywhere else.
That's
And as much
bait,
as
Will. That's
My
bait for
blood is
Luke.
boiling here that you said that. I can't
no,
believe you said
but
that.
I know what you mean. Like, for Irish rugby's health, Frawley, I think, is the answer. But I just think from Leinster's perspective, if you're Leo Cullen, where do I get Jordie Barrett onto the field without weakening other areas? You go without half. He can kick a goal. He can kick tactically. He's a big physical defender. He can handle the ball well. When I thought about it, I was like, actually, it's a no-brainer. Well, why would you play him at fullback when you have Hugo Keenan, or at 12 when you have Robbie Henshaw? You could have him at number
Play him on the
23.
wing, no?
You could squeeze him onto the wing.
Sorry, by the way, I don't think he plays. I think he's on the bench.
As a number 23.
Yeah. He's perfect for that. And he's not the best 10. I think Frawley would be a better 10. I don't think he's a great 10.
Haven't seen him play it much there, but I think he has all the skills to play there. And I think with like Leo Cullen not being kind of that committed to Kieran Frawley, I'd be interested to see if Jordie Barrett gets the nod there. I don't see it happening, but it was the first thing that popped into my head when I really thought about it.
It doesn't make any sense, that move at all, does it? Do you think?
Part of it is definitely bums on seats. They're going to the Aviva next season. They're not in the RDS. They want to sell tickets. That was definitely part of the reason, I think, why they were allowed to sign on a short-term deal. But for the betterment of Leinster and Irish rugby, look, you can make the argument young guys can learn off him. But when it comes to it in the big games, he is going to be playing. I'd be very surprised if they use him off the bench, I have to say, in the big Champions Cup games. The wing was the one spot that maybe came to mind. But then again, you look at Jordan Larmour had a decent season last year. Jimmy O'Brien,
he's nowhere near him. Jordan Larmour's nowhere near Jordie Barrett. No,
but no, absolutely. But I'm just saying that was the one position on the right wing where I thought you could put. Well, sorry, you could put him anywhere, but I don't see him playing ahead of Robbie Henshaw and Gary Ringrose if they're both fit. I just don't see that happening, and I haven't seen enough of him as a 10. Will, to be honest, to know. His brother would be pretty good at 10. I know that, but I haven't seen enough of him at 10.
I have never seen.
You know what though? If you put him on the wing, you all of a sudden become gigantic. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you think about how physically imposing that team is, because Frawley as a 10 is very physical. Like Barrett is very physical. Like, really, really big. Like, he's a big man.
Jack Nienaber would love that big.
Oh well, like if you think Osborne at 15, who's a big man. You've got Barrett on the right, and you've got Lowe on the left, and then you got the two boys in the center, like, and Frawley at 10. Like, I think, like, who's breaking down that defense? Pretty hard to do that. And then obviously physical going forward too. Everyone's a running threat. Everyone's good in the air. I love it. I love it. I love them on the wing, but I don't think it's right for Irish rugby. I think O'Brien and Larmour, then, what happens then? And if it's Osborne and Keenan, like, one of them lose out too. I don't know. What do you think? Am I talking crazy? Does that sound like a physical team?
Well, I thought maybe Hugo Keenan might decide to play another sevens tournament next year, so there could be a gap open there. Don't know what his schedule is as yet.
Big question: does he come straight back into your team?
Yes.
Yeah. No. For me,
no. He can't. Keane. That's shocking. He couldn't.
Yeah. So Ireland play the All Blacks on a Friday night at the start of November. Keane, is he starting full back for you? Someone asked us this, so it counts as our listener question. I just don't know.
Without a doubt. I just think without a doubt. I don't think Hugo Keenan will be punished for I know you guys are quite strong in this. I'm not. I don't think Hugo Keenan will be punished for going chasing an Olympic medal for a few months.
He's not punished. He just doesn't.
You're
get
rewarding Jamie Osborne for stepping into extremely different.
Is Jamie Osborne, in my mind, certainly isn't going to be playing at fullback for Leinster next season when Hugo Keenan is there in the big games. I don't think.
So is he completely dropped? Is Osborne completely? Is he dropped?
I think he goes to 23. Yeah, for Leinster.
Jesus, you're harsh. You're a harsh taskmaster.
We're talking about the best fullback in the world.
I think you might be right, but he doesn't play 15s. He plays 7s. No.
All jokes aside, though, like he, as I said, he opted to not play in that series. Osborne came in and played unbelievably well, and we were saying one of the great wins the Irish team has achieved. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that Jamie Osborne gets another chance against the All Blacks to see what he can do. He stepped up in very difficult, one of the most difficult circumstances
He
you
was
could
good in the
make your
first test
debut.
too, Will.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he deserves another shot, and Hugo Keenan can play maybe against Argentina the following week to work his way back into the team. And I would see it as rewarding Jamie Osborne, not punishing. I'm not a vindictive man, Keen. I wouldn't punish anyone, but I do think Jamie Osborne deserves a
Not how you
shot.
phrased it last week.
That was a private conversation.
We should be in like a bunker in our selection meeting ahead of that the All Blacks Friday night game.
No
the left
leaks.
wing bunker.
Like I
Oh
just like to,
God,
yeah, I know
that's
it'll be an
very harsh,
interesting.
Cian. I didn't think you were that. I didn't think you were that harsh.
I should stress this. I thought Jamie Osborne was brilliant. I thought it was such a positive 2 games for him. But I just think Hugo Keenan is the best fullback in the world. He's got so much credit in the bank. That I would be surprised if he doesn't come back in. But if Leinster decide to go down the route that you do and Jamie Osborne ends up starting at 15 next season, and that's a very different conversation. But I don't see that happening once the Champions Cup starts up in December, whenever it is, or sorry, even before that, the bigger games before November, obviously. I just think Hugo Keenan will be back in the team. As harsh as that is, look, with the way injuries go, one of the centres could be out injured. Jamie Osborne will be back in the centre, but I suppose cutthroat business at the top, Luke.
I don't know, because I think we're loaded in the centres. I think we've got Aki. I actually thought McCluskey was really good for the little cameo he showed, and I think he's been playing brilliantly. So I don't think he's needed there. I think he's like a plug in there. I think he looks so good at fullback. Anyway, look, yeah, I've obviously softer heart than you.
Luke, to be fair, you made the point at the time, and you said, "Oh, I would never be giving away my jersey voluntarily." And at the time, I didn't think it was a possibility that someone would come in and play so well. But it's a good lesson to other players in the squad that you don't just hold the jersey in perpetuity. Like if you decide to leave for whatever reason, and someone comes in and plays really, really well, you don't have a right to get it back automatically.
But I don't think Hugo Keenan is going to think that he has a right. Like, I mean, from talking to a few people, like, he didn't just wake up one day and decide to do it. I think he actually found it a quite difficult decision to make. Obviously, that was the decision he came to in the end. It's going to be really interesting to see how he gets on over the next few days. But I think we should probably remember that it was probably a tricky decision for Hugo Keenan as well. That's my softer side coming out.
But he made the wrong one. Like, I don't know. I just think you never give someone, you never, he was so far ahead of everyone else in the conversation. Like I would, and this is I promise you, I'm not trying to be like dramatic or anything here, but like you never give a sucker a chance ever. And that's how far behind the competition was from Keenan. But now all of a sudden I'm looking at it going, well, like it doesn't get any more difficult than South Africa away from home. And that guy produced 2 really good performances. So I just don't see how you can drop someone having done that. That doesn't make any sense to me. No matter how good Keenan has been, I just wouldn't be doing it. So yeah, maybe we just think differently about it.
And
I just think you never give a sucker a chance. It's like Leinster with Munster 2 years ago. You never ever, if you pick your best team for the big matches, and that's it. You never give another team a chance if you're better than them, because belief, momentum, these things in sport matter. They matter, and you don't give someone a chance to do it, because that guy's got belief now. He thinks he should be in the team, and he's played great against the best team in the world. I was just talking earlier on the show about what a win in South Africa does for your mentality. When you come up against the best teams, you know you can do it in the most difficult of circumstances. So that guy now believes that. So no matter what, it's not going to be easier. It's not going to be easy for Keenan, even if he is given the jersey, which I think you think you're probably right, by the way. But even if he is given the jersey, it's not as easy to hold on to it for him now either. I think it was a big mistake. And plus, on his CV, a win in South Africa, to be missing that, that would be gutting for me anyway.
I think Andy Farrell he could look at it the way you guys are looking at it and say, well, he was the last man to deliver for me. And also, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that he could go, well, it doesn't really matter that Jamie Osborne hasn't been playing at 15 for Leinster, because he wasn't playing at 15 for Leinster before I threw him in for 2 tests in South Africa. We've seen this before, that Andy Farrell is his own man. He's his own selector. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility, but I think Keenan has delivered so often for him in the past that has to count for something too.
Well, it's certainly one of the big talking points heading into next season. And I knew this short listeners' question podcast was never going to remain that way. I'd like to thank Luke and Cian for joining me in this week's show, and for everyone who reached out with their questions. Apologies we couldn't get to any more, but for the people we did get to discuss their talking points, thanks so much for sending those in. Myself, Luke, and Cian will be back for one more podcast next week, where we're going to pick our Lions 23s, looking ahead to that tour in Australia. In the meantime, you can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or listen on the Irish Independent website. So until next week, thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.